Skin Deep, written and narrated by Saffron Bryant. Chapter 15. Ravyn's blood pounded with adrenaline as she marched up the hill. Noise like thunder surrounded her, the sound of hundreds of footsteps marching in time. People swarmed through the Undesirable district, hurling their masks to the ground to be crushed by the masses. Ravyn strode at the front of her army. Lines of people trailed out behind her, filling the streets of the district. Deep voices hummed a steady working chant as the army marched towards the castle. Tension hung in the air like a cloud, ready to burst and drown the kingdom. Sweat mixed with something else, hope, swirled over the crowd. For the first time that Ravyn could ever remember, the Undesirables walked with straight backs, their heads held high. Their firm eyes locked on the castle, unwavering. The wave of strength washed over Ravyn, and she couldn't help but join in with the chant. Her voice joined those of her fellows, and the song swelled, echoing down the thin alleys and creating a path before them. The Undesirables carried whatever weapons they could find. Those at the front held the guns and grenades that Ravyn and the robots had collected. Towards the back, they carried homemade spears and butcher's knives. Grumpy, Leaky, and Doc marched at Ravyn's side, beside Atoll and Jerry. They looked stern, serious, except Grumpy. For the first time since Ravyn had met him, he seemed happy, practically grinning as they strode closer to the castle. At the edge of the Undesirable district, where it joined the lower Desirable district, stood a small contingent of the Queen's escort. With weapons in hand, they stared stony-faced at the approaching army. The leader, a man in red, stepped forward as Ravyn reached the border. "It is an offense for an Undesirable to enter the Desirable district without appropriate covering." Ravyn stepped forward so that her toes almost touched those of the escort. "Step aside and you'll go unharmed." Jerry strode up beside her. "This isn't a day to be stupid. You and your men get out of here if you want to live." The soldier stood straighter and brandished his weapon. "This is your last warning. You may not enter the Desirable district without appropriate covering. We should not be forced to look at you and your companions." Ravyn gritted her teeth and put her hand on the gun at her belt. Before she could pull it, something crackled from behind her and she instinctively ducked. The officer exploded in a shower of red and collapsed to the ground beside her. Shouts erupted from both groups, accompanied by loud bangs. The scent of gunpowder filled the air, along with the tang of blood. Ravyn blinked and scrambled to her feet. 3 escorts lay dead beside 4 Undesirables. Grumpy stood, providing cover for the army, while the royal escorts rained bullets into him. Ravyn whipped the gun from her belt and aimed at the frontmost escort. She fired, and the gun kicked. The escort flew back, his chest blooming red, and collapsed to the ground. His glassy eyes stared unseeing at the chaos. Ravyn flexed her fingers and turned to the next escort, but before she could fire, his head whipped back and he crumpled. Only 2 escorts remained, a man and a woman. They glanced at each other, their faces white. "Surrender and you will live," Ravyn called. The escorts nodded to each other and darted away, disappearing into adjacent side streets. The Undesirables howled and some gave chase. Jerry held up his hand. "Leave them. We'll face them soon enough." The Undesirables fell back into line behind Ravyn and the others. Some stopped to drag the fallen rebels away from the army. They'd be given a hero's burial. Pools of blood colored the street, soaking into the cement. Ravyn stepped over the fallen escorts and continued up the hill. She glanced back in time to see Undesirables swarm over the bodies, stripping them of weapons and anything of value. She clenched her fist and kept marching. The streets that led to the castle remained eerily still and silent. The mansions towered on either side, hollow, their occupants fled or hiding. At the final turn before the castle gates, Ravyn spotted a familiar figure, her blonde hair shining in the sunlight. Dorabella stood on her tiptoes, neck craning as Ravyn approached. "There are so many!" Her wide eyes shone. I had no idea there were so many undesirables. I thought there were only a few. Ravyn pursed her lips. You and most of the desirables. That's what this is about, showing that they're a force to be reckoned with, that they matter. Dorabella bit her lip and nodded. She gestured to the timid people crowding behind her. They hunched their shoulders and clung to the shadows. These are the desirables I could find to stand with us. 20 men and women stood behind Dorabella, far from an army and far from the 2% who had voted against Queen Elena. Ravyn nodded to a tall woman with a lined face. Lady Beckett? Ravyn? The woman inclined her head. I suppose I should have known when you stood up to those boys that you'd make change. And I should have known when you stopped them beating me that you were more than the average desirable. Ravyn turned back to Dorabella. You've done well. Most of them had ceremonial weapons, but they're not much good. Ravyn frowned. I didn't have enough for even 10% of the undesirables, let alone extras. A woman with a tall, plumed hat tugged at the elbow of a broad-shouldered man. You see, Vincent? They don't even have weapons. How are we supposed to fight without weapons? I swear, your ridiculous talk about equality was bad enough, but now you've dragged me into this. I should have listened to my sister and never married you. The man's face glowed red and he glared over his shoulder at the woman. Would you be quiet, Gloria? I told you you didn't have to come. This isn't a bloody tea party with your stupid friends. The woman's mouth dropped and her eyes narrowed. Go on. Go back home then. This isn't the place for you. You don't understand the bigger picture. Gloria put her hands on her hips and red flushed her cheeks. What bigger picture? I swear, Vincent, it's all in your head. You and your foolish friends. She waved her hands at 2 men standing nearby. Just wait until Queen Elena gets her hands on you. Oh, she'll make you pay. A wave of murmurs rushed through the undesirable army, and the sound of restless twitching filled the street. Ravyn stepped forward before the army could erupt. Gloria, is it? Well, Gloria, I think you're missing the point of this army if you think the Queen will have any chance of making anyone pay. Gloria whirled on Ravyn, her skirts flaring. How dare a little undesirable like you interrupt my conversation with my husband? When I want to talk with filth, I'll start cleaning. Ravyn bit her tongue and resisted the urge to let the army tear the other woman to pieces. Vincent laid a hand on Gloria's arm and tugged her back. You fool, woman! Do you know who you're talking to? You're lucky Lady Ravyn has such a merciful heart, or you'd be dead. Gloria tilted her chin and looked down her nose at Ravyn. She wouldn't dare. Vincent let her hand drop and stepped away from his wife. Do what you must, he said to Ravyn. Ravyn sighed and glanced over her shoulder. Already some of the undesirables had their guns pointed at Gloria. I will spare your life this time. However, I can't afford to have people like you roaming free. Dorabella and Lady Beckett here will see that you're put somewhere safe and out of the way. If, when this is all over, your husband feels like rescuing you, he can. If he's decided he has better things to do, well, I'm sure the rats and filth will keep you company. The colour drained from Gloria's face, and she shook her head. You won't. You can't. 2 undesirables stepped forward and held Gloria's arms behind her back. Get your filthy hands off me! If you wouldn't mind, Dorabella, Lady Beckett, Ravyn said. Best find a good place. I sense she may not be the last of her kind. Dorabella and Lady Beckett nodded and led the undesirables, dragging a wailing Gloria down a side street. Ravyn studied the rest of the desirables. Vincent's face glowed red, but he didn't turn to watch his wife get dragged away. The others clung to each other, determination shining from their eyes. The rest of you find places in the ranks. Spread out. This is where the desegregation begins. If you don't like standing next to an undesirable, then you can follow Gloria. The desirables jumped into action and hurried past Ravyn into the mass of undesirables. They spread out and created coloured specks amongst the mostly dirt-stained crowd. Vincent took a place in the front line, on Grumpy's other side, and shook hands with the undesirables around him. Good to have you with us, Jerry bellowed with a wide smile. The corners of Vincent's mouth lifted and he pumped Jerry's hand. Ravyn's stomach jumped. There was hope after all. End chapter. Be sure to like and subscribe so you'll know when the next chapter is released.